El mundo puede detenerse. Tus sueños no. Elige bien. Elige UPB.
Okay, good morning to all the audience in Colombia and Latin America, and good afternoon to our audience in Germany and Europe. I am Margarita Lopez from Universidad de Caldas, and today I will be guiding the event as moderator. Welcome to the second part of the HEPCOPA lecture series, a project organized by the Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana Bucaramanga and the University of Potsdam as part of the Higher Education Potsdam-Colombian Partnership. The HEPCOPA project is a bilateral initiative developed jointly by Colombia and Germany, in which the University of Potsdam, Universidad de Caldas, Pontificia Universidad Bolivariana de Cali, Colombian Universities Association, and Universidad Pontificia Bolivariana Bucaramanga have worked together since 2018 to build up capacities in the areas of quality, digitalization, and management in higher education. Today, we are going to talk about partnership in leadership, Colombians' role in German sustainability diplomacy, a trend that is closely related to societal transformation. And before the start of the lecture, I want to invite you to the virtual course, Societal Transformation Processes. The HEPCOPA lecture series will give a participation certificate to the audience that complete at least 80% of the activities that will be posted on the platform. If you want to complete your registration in the course, please click on the link that is fixed on the top of the YouTube chat. Now we will be starting the talk, so let me introduce you to our speaker for this lecture, Professor Christian Rick. Professor Rick is an assistant professor in contemporary history and international relations at the University of Potsdam and a lecturer in global governance and comparative regional integration at Humboldt University, Berlin, and also Universidad Rey Juan Carlos in Madrid. He was a staff officer for Agenda 2030 and international development cooperation issues for Konrad Adenauer Institute in Berlin. Christian holds a postgraduate degree in Latin American Studies by the University of Oxford. Before, he studied law and economics in Beirut and Seville, then European and international public law at HU Berlin, as well as the European University Institute in Florence. Professor Rick, welcome to the HEPCOPA lecture series.
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. Muchas gracias por la invitación. What I want to do today is to talk to you about, say, a case study for German, what I call German sustainability diplomacy. The German speakers amongst you might know this as Nachhaltigkeitsaußenpolitik. I'll explain to you in a minute what I mean by this. I think it has several elements. And Colombia is an interesting case study because Germany doesn't have a bilateral partnership agreement with Colombia when it comes to, say, climate or energy, like with other countries. But I think it would be a very interesting case study. It would be a great country to have such a partnership. And my argument will be that we should think beyond the climate and energy partnerships that Germany has been establishing over the past, say, 10 to 15 years, and think about more complete, more holistic sustainability partnerships. And I'll explain to you in the next half hour what I mean by that. All right, sorry about this. My computer froze and I couldn't see what was happening. Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Ray, we can hear you very well.
All right. So if you hear me, let me just start. Sorry. So you can't see them. Try again. All right, so now you should see the slides. Sorry about this. Yesterday worked perfectly. All right, so a partnership in leadership, Colombia's role in German sustainability policy. What I'm trying to do now in, say, 30 to 35 minutes is to give you a basic definition of what sustainability is. And then I'll conceptualize sustainability diplomacy using information and concepts from scientific cooperation or science diplomacy, because I think they make sense and they fit quite well, quite neatly into what I'm trying to say here. And then I'll explain to you the specifics of the German approach to sustainability. So aims, actors, instruments, and partners. And I welcome criticism if you think this is not sort of specifically to the German way of doing things. I think this is great. So please ask as many questions as you want. But let's do this at the end of the Q&A session. But I'm happy to sort of invite criticism, invite questions. And then we'll talk about the German-Colombian Sustainability Partnership, or how I conceptualize it. And so I'll give you sort of a few data points on sort of ODA, so official development cooperation, and then how we can think about together about how to enlarge or go beyond the sort of climate paradigm that rules the German Colombian bilateral relations right now. And I'll invite questions on how to create a more equal partnership. So definitions first. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is the most basic and the most standard definition by the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development. It's the most widely cited one, but it's also a bit fuzzy, right? It's not operationalized yet. right? But this is the basic idea. The gist of it is that we shouldn't use more resources now in order to leave enough for the future generations to also have sort of a good life, right, on this planet. And what's important to remember is that sustainability has 3 dimensions. It's not just a purely ecological concept, right? It started out as an ecological concept, but it now has 3 dimensions that are sort of all equal in value. One is ecological, the other one is economic, and the third one is social. And all of this goes back to the Rio Summit in 1992. If you're not familiar with it, I invite you to read up on it. It's a very interesting sort of moment in international relations, and it's what I would call the big bang in the development debate, sorry, in the sustainability debate. That is still a development debate in 1992. But what's interesting about Rio is that the summit pioneered a series of major international sustainability frameworks, and all of them are with us today, still with us today. Right, so the Rio Declaration, of course, is a declaration that has been signed by all UN member states. But then Rio created the Commission on Sustainable Development, which is now the high-level political forum on sustainable development. It's still with us, and it has sort of gotten a new role. It's been re-energized by Agenda 2030, because the high-level political forum is the place where countries go to, or signatory states go to once a year to learn lessons from each other. Rio pioneered Agenda 21, so that's not to be confused with Agenda 2030. Agenda 21 was basically a sort of a work program to try to anchor the ideas and concepts of sustainability on the local level. It was the most effective or successful on the local level, but success was very uneven. Agenda 21 is almost forgotten today, and this is because not all countries were equally sort of invested in Agenda 21, and that's sort of a big difference to Agenda 2030, of course. But it also it started out as a Rio initiative, and then forest principles, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. So all of these very important multilateral governance frameworks that were all pioneered in Rio. And the Rio Summit happened or took place from the 3rd to the 14th of June in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, of course. And it's an interesting moment in time because it's not the first Earth Summit. The first one was in 1972, so Rio was the 3rd one. Once every 10 years, countries would meet and talk about sustainable development. The first one was in 72 and created UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program. But what happened in Rio is that the wall had just come down, the Cold War was unwinding, and it was sort of this moment. It's a very peculiar moment in time where the international community could come together now in a more sort of complete and unburdened fashion than before. And I would say this opened up sort of the debate, or a space for debate on sustainability that was sort of more comprehensive than before and less politicized, less burdened by ideology and the Cold War than before. So this is what makes 1992 so interesting. And also, don't forget that the Rio Summit took place shortly after a very successful implementation of the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol basically was sort of made to curb emissions of CFCs, to close the gap in the ozone layer. And this started in the mid-80s. It was already sort of a trans-bipolar initiative, right? So it was countries mainly countries from the West, right? But also countries from the Soviet bloc that took part, and it was very successful. Right, so this is sort of an interesting case study when we think about gridlock today, right? So why have international regimes become more ambitious but less successful, right? Even though there's more and more stakeholders, more and more countries signing on to these frameworks. And Montreal is a very successful example. And this sort of gave impetus and dynamism to Rio. I think this is another reason why Rio went so well. And sustainability, of course, or sustainable development is still with us as a concept, right? And the latest iteration are the Sustainable Development Goals, signed in 2015 at the World Summit in New York. And you all might be familiar with these 17 goals. It's basically 16 plus 1. The last one is a partnership goal that tries to sort of perpetuate the work program, right, that is entailed in these goals. And if you just have a sort of a cursory look at these 16 or 17 goals, then you can see how ambitious sustainable development has become as a concept and as an idea. Right. So this goes also well beyond the three dimensions that I've mentioned in the beginning: ecological, economic, and social. It's really very large, and it was a mainstreaming exercise, a so-called mainstreaming exercise, because there were so many overlapping and competing world regimes that dealt with sort of individual issues, right, and sort of under the roof of the United Nations, and the Sustainable Development Goals were sort of an exercise to bring together all of these thematic streams and give them coherence. Right? So it's an exercise in coherence as well. Tremendously successful in 2015. All countries signed on to this. And beneath these 17 goals, you have 156 targets. Right? So it's a very ambitious and sort of work program, but it's also been operationalized already. Right? So you have targets that you can sort of then measure your own success against. And this is, I think, very interesting. It's also a paradigm shift in international development cooperation, because it's now more sort of results focused. Right, and also more sort of easier to operationalize. Right? So this is what makes Agenda 2030 really special. Also, it's an agenda that is not a development cooperation agenda, right? So it's not an agenda for developing countries, but it's an agenda for all countries in the world, including the rich world, the industrialized nations. And for Germany, this has been sort of very interesting because Germany had, after 1992, after Rio, had sort of embarked on a national program of sustainability, right? I mean, that's probably too much, but Germany wrote a sustainability strategy in the early 2000s and had to rewrite it completely after 2015 when Agenda 2030 came about. And Germany was sort of very meticulous about this, and the new strategy paper was a sort of what we call a whole of government approach, right? So all cabinet level ministries sort of inputted into this document. So it's a document by the federal government and not by one particular ministry. And this new strategy was and still is sort of very ambitious. It has lots of goals and targets as well, and deals with all the different levels of government in Germany, right? So federal, national, and then subnational, especially the Länder and local municipalities as well. Yeah, so this strategy is something like a gold standard right now. It's a very sort of ambitious but very interesting and exciting strategy. All right. So let's define this emerging policy field. So what is sustainability diplomacy? Right? We've just established that sustainability is complex, right? It's very ambitious also as a concept. So what is sustainability diplomacy? And I would say the sort of the easiest or most straightforward definition would be the use of foreign policy instruments by a given state to achieve sustainability goals at home and abroad. And so foreign policy instruments, right? So the idea is that you have sustainability, but not just sustainability at home, but that you become as a country an activist for sustainability abroad. So you use foreign policy instruments. And the idea is, of course, that sustainability is something that is not sort of much like, say, climate change. The fight against climate change is not something that you can do in your own country alone, right? So you need sort of all the other countries in your surroundings, in your neighborhood, but also in the world, right, to sort of be on the same page, right, to really then change, to change the paradigms, right, of how we produce, how we consume, right, in order to protect the climate and our planet. So this is why it has a sort of a very strong foreign policy element to it. It's related with, but not limited to, climate diplomacy, energy diplomacy, international environmental diplomacy, global health policy, development policy, at least in the German case, and science diplomacy. Right? So my argument here is that sort of all of these sort of elements of foreign relations deal with issues or parts of the sustainability agenda. Right? And this requires then, of course, more coherence on the level of the federal government, right, to then become something like a unified, a coherent sustainability diplomacy actor in the world. Yeah, and this definition draws on the definition for science diplomacy that is put forward by the American Association of the Advancement of Science, AAAS. They also sort of have these three elements. They sound a bit different, but the basic idea is the same. And I would sort of use this and do a transfer and think about sort of sustainability. And I would say the three elements are diplomacy for sustainability, and I'll explain to you in a minute what I mean by this. Diplomacy for sustainability, sustainability for diplomacy, and then sustainability science in diplomacy. And for the German speakers amongst you, I think you can translate them into sort of these three terms that are similar but not identical, right? So internationale Nachhaltigkeitspolitik, Nachhaltigkeitsaußenpolitik, and that's a term that you can find in the strategy papers right now, right? So it's a new term, but the Foreign Office uses it already. And then Nachhaltigkeitswissenschaftspolitik, all right? So the science, sort of the science part, so in the sustainability diplomacy. So let me give you some more information on this. So what is diplomacy for sustainability? Diplomacy that facilitates international cooperation in order to advance sustainability goals. Right? So I think this would be the sort of the most basic understanding of it. And then think about flagship international projects in which nations come together to collaborate on high-cost, high-risk endeavors that would otherwise not be conducted. Right. So take Agenda 2030, right? Or if we take energy transformation, think about sort of big energy projects in renewables or so, things that would not be done otherwise, right? So make this a flagship project, but also this is then open to international cooperation, right? And then this makes it easier to be conducted. And also refers to the set of national policies that facilitate international cooperation on sustainability. Right? So, but this would be secondary sort of elements. The most important one is the first one. Okay, so you facilitate international cooperation in order to advance sustainability globally. So this is diplomacy for sustainability. So diplomacy sort of enables sustainability on all different levels of governance. The next one then would be sustainability for diplomacy. Cooperation on sustainability issues can improve international relations, right? Because it draws on the universal language of sustainability to engage countries, reinforce relationships, and ease tensions in situations of political strain, right? So, I don't know, if a country like Iran that is internationally sort of isolated, right? It might still sort of buy into the universal language of sustainability, and the sustainability sort of policy area or as an issue area would open up avenues of cooperation despite, right, other sort of political fields being strained, right? Yeah, and this sort of, in theory, would also sort of be valid or should be valid for Russia, right? Despite the present political situation, right? So that we can sort of disagree in some areas, right? But there's still sort of this more sort of cosmopolitan, idealistic maybe, or constructivist idea that we still need to sort of cooperate in these other areas, especially when it comes to what we call global structural policy. Right? So changing to the paradigms on the international level, right, to make our systems and our infrastructures, our world, right, more sustainable. So that's sustainability for diplomacy, right? So you can use sustainability to enhance or amplify diplomatic efforts or to achieve diplomatic means or aims, right? And the third one is sustainability science in diplomacy. I think it has sustainability, much like climate, has sort of a very strong scientific imprint. Science can inform diplomatic decisions or agreements in matters concerning sustainability, and this makes it then evidence-based and hopefully less ideological, more technocratic or technical, right? So which on the global level makes sense, especially in our geopolitical world, or the geopolitical world that we're entering now. So then science has this sort of, as a neutral arbiter, in inverted commas, has a special role to play. For example, scientific study can set out the relevant evidence to help solve a disagreement between two countries in that area of sustainability, or it can provide benchmarks by which international treaties can be regulated. Right? Also, if we take Agenda 2030 and the operationalization of these goals and sort of the coming up with concrete targets is a scientific question fundamentally, right? Or in the fight against climate change, right? It's quite clear that science there has sort of a role to play, and not as an activist, right? But as a sort of a neutral informant, right? Or consultant to policy. So these would be the three elements. So what then makes sustainability diplomacy specifically German? So what's the German understanding of it? And I would say there's a few things that Germany takes more seriously, right, or focuses on more in foreign policy, and it could be aims or instruments or partners than other countries in the global north. And the first one to me is the focus on multilateralism. Right, so that's sort of the German foreign policy reflex, is to look for international organization and set the agenda there. Yeah? And this, of course, is highly compatible to the sustainability debate, which is a global debate. Right? But there's a strong focus on multilateralism, that you cannot go it alone. And I think that's quite clear in the fight against climate change or in sustainability more broadly. The second one would be the focus on institutions and institution building. Right? So say if you have in a region, if you don't have a regional organization that deals with climate, then Germany would try to cajole a regional organization to broaden its mandate, right? Or it would try to convince countries to then sort of engage in transnational, international sort of relations in that area as well, right? So there's a focus on institutions and institution building. Why? Because institutions help to keep the focus, right, on a particular policy area. So it makes it more long-term. So I think it makes sense to think about sort of how you create institutions and how you design them and how you make them sort of resilient, right, against spoilers or against sort of a lack of attention by the political elites. The next one would be multi-level governance and self-reinforcing structures, right? This is sort of the European experience, right? That we set the agenda on the European level, right? This will reinforce sustainability structures at home. Right? And then, of course, if there's a strong consensus at home, instead of on how to sort of deal with sustainability, take the energy transition, renewables, and there's different ideas that are floating around, then if you can sort of use that consensus to then influence the EU level, say, or the subnational level, right, then this becomes a self-reinforcing structure, right, as long as there's enough alignment, right, between these different levels. And so that's a European experience, and Germany then, of course, uses that logic, right, when it tries to make the political agendas in different international organizations more coherent. The idea is the more the better, right? So the more alignment there is between different organizations, the more self-reinforcing will these structures become across the globe. Then network orientation to involve a wide variety of actors. I'll give you a few examples later, right? So this is really what we call a whole of society approach, right? So the actors come from all different walks of life, from all different sectors, and this makes sense because sustainability really is a societal sort of mandate, right? So it's not something you can delegate to national governments, right? It's something that sort of local communities, municipalities, right, all different sort of levels of government and all different sectors, and even private individuals, right, would have to sort of be part of. So this is what I call network orientation. In Germany, sustainability is based on a broad societal and political consensus, right? So this is not a sort of a project of the political left or a project of the political right. Right? This is very important because this explains why Germany can sort of then focus on this for a long time instead of changing its focus all the time whenever there's a new government that comes in. It's evidence-based and preference-based, right? So there's an alignment there too, right? I would say the sustainability debate is not very ideological in Germany, right? So it's preference-based on the political level, but it also, that aligns with the preferences of the society, right? And then it also aligns with what the science says, right? And this is then also becomes a self-reinforcing system. And I think this makes it's like specific to Germany. It might be different in some developing countries, especially. Right, where there might be less evidence-based sort of policy approaches, but also maybe sort of there's less societal consensus about this, right, or political consensus. And then, as I've already explained, there's a whole of government approach, right? So it's clear that sustainability is something that the whole government will have to deal with, all the ministries, and also the whole of society. And then 2 question marks here. So is Germany a sustainability activist? Right? I don't know if it sees itself that way, right? But it can come across that way. Yeah. And then the question, of course, is how connected is the sustainability activism to economic interests, right? It's clear that Germany has sort of a renewable energy industrial sector, and of course that sector has economic interests abroad. I wouldn't say the sector is as sort of powerful or strong as sort of the car industry, say, or the chemical and pharmacological industry, but still it has economic interests, right? So if you do sort of development cooperation and sort of open up sort of, I don't know, create the regulatory and sort of economic base for investment, then of course Germany would have an interest that investment would come from Germany also, right? Not just from Germany, but there is an economic interest. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a bad thing, because at the end of the day, this would still sort of further, right, or strengthen sustainability, say locally or in the partner country or at home. Right. So then I thought about, well, is there a German definition of sustainability that might be sort of different, right? To differ from what we've learned from the United Nations. And this definition is taken from the National Sustainability Strategy of 2021. So that's the latest iteration, latest update of that strategy. And they basically say the guiding principles on which the strategy is based are intergenerational equity, quality of life, social cohesion, and global responsibility, right? So there you have it. The global responsibility sort of explains the international activism in this sustainability area. Indicators are laid out in the strategy with medium and long-term objectives to be achieved. And so all these strategies today, then they're sort of goals and indicator-based, something that was not the case, say, 10 years ago. Right. So what does this mean then for Germany? So the aims of sustainability at home would be these, and these are also, of course, quite sort of broad. They're all taken from the strategy, from the sustainability strategy: human flourishing and social justice, energy transition and climate protection, circular economy, sustainable construction, changes in transport. So this means basically sort of more public transport, less cars in the streets, sustainable agriculture and food production, unpolluted environment. Right? And then you have a chapter, it's a short one, but you have a chapter on sustainability diplomacy. This is an explicit aim in the sustainability strategy. So, right, if you see how broad this issue area is nationally, then of course this explains the variety of actors involved, right, in the implementation and in the design of the policies, right? So you have several federal ministries, and this is true for sort of everything that happens here at home in Germany, but also it's also true for the foreign policy dimension, right? So these other ministries don't delegate the foreign relations to the Foreign Office, right? But all of these ministries engage in a foreign policy of their own. Right? And examples here would be BMZ, that's the Development Cooperation Ministry, BMU, that's for the environmental protection. There was the ministry responsible for the climate partnerships before international climate diplomacy was attached to the Foreign Office in January of this year. And then BMWK, that's the Economy Ministry, that's now been renamed. It's now the Federal Ministry for the Economy and Climate Protection. Right, so there's a connection there as well now. And then BMG, that's for health, and BML is for agriculture. Right, so all of these ministries have their own sort of foreign relations instruments, and they're all sort of engaged in sustainability diplomacy. But of course, what you can see here is that you have a problem when it comes to coherence. Right, it's very difficult to design a foreign policy that is unified and coherent if you have so many actors on board. Then, of course, you have EU institutions like the Commission, the Council, the regulatory agencies, right? If you take human rights standards or environmental standards, right? So these standards then become de facto global standards, right? That's the so-called Brussels effect. So the EU institutions are part of that sort of game as well. And then, of course, multilateral organizations like the whole UN family, basically, but especially, I would say, the UN Development Program, the Environment Program, and the WHO. There's at least one sustainable development goal that deals with health, and then there's probably more. And then sort of these are sort of the federal level, right? The federal ministries, and then you have sort of the multilateral level of governance, and then of course you have sort of the subnational level, and this would be implementing agencies, right? So agencies charged with implementing these policies abroad, funded usually by development cooperation monies, right, of Germany. This would be GIZ, that's the Development Cooperation Agency. KfW is the German Development Bank. Political foundations, say, and then the DAAD for academic exchange, right? So if you think about scientific integration, scientific collaboration, then the DAAD would be sort of the funding, the donor agency. And then, of course, it's not just state, it's also non-state, right? So you have civil society organizations, like national and transnational NGOs. Take Greenpeace, take the World Wildlife Fund, but you can also take national NGOs, and sometimes they also sort of become regional NGOs. So all of these are sort of helpers, right, really, and actors in their own right when it comes to sustainability diplomacy, right? So it could be sort of you enable an NGO by giving money to it, right? And then that NGO can do education or it can do local projects, right? So they're also then part of the solution. And lastly, we have the research infrastructure. And there's a few here, IASS, AWI, PIK, and GFZ are all Potsdam institutes, and they all deal with sustainability issues, sort of broadly speaking, right? So one is sort of deals with the poles and oceans, another one with climate protection and climate modeling, and a few others. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And Wuppertal Institute is a specialized institute that deals with sustainability issues. So what I'm trying to say here is that Germany has sort of a specialized research infrastructure, right, for sustainability. And of course, that then sort of is an infrastructure that you can use, you can leverage, right, on the international level as well. All right, so what's German about sustainability, right? Was there a specific German way? And then, of course, the energy transition in Germany, called Energiewende, is the central element, the central tenet, right, of German sustainability policy at home, but also abroad. Now that's important to understand. It has this sort of international dimension as well. And the idea is to switch, right, switch towards renewable energy production, really, and to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And what's interesting here is that even sort of the foreign policy element of it is done by the Federal Ministry for the Economy and Climate Protection, not by the Foreign Office, say, or by the Ministry for Development, say. And then the next question would be, well, what about international climate diplomacy, right? The foreign minister has just sort of redesigned the Foreign Office, has integrated international climate policy, as part of the Foreign Office, right? So it becomes more political now, also more activist, say. And in January 2022, the former president of Greenpeace International, and this is the woman here in the image, Jennifer Morgan, was made Climate Czar, Sonderbeauftragter for international climate policy, right? So Germany has this ambition, or renewed ambition, right, to become a player in the climate debate internationally, and has given it a new face, right, and a new institutional infrastructure behind it. So the question is this really a German trademark? And I would say, well, Germany has always been a climate champion, right? And climate has been sort of a very important element and part in the sustainability debate. Right, so this activism will go on, but I would say it will have to become broader, right? It would have to morph into a sustainability activism. All right, so I was thinking about actors. So this is KfW and GIZ, the Development Bank and the Development Agency, all sort of funded or under the responsibility directed by the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. That ministry historically has been sort of the ministry the most invested in the UN system and the most invested in this so-called global structural policy. Right, despite having sort of a strong sort of bilateral element as well, right? So there's still sort of Germany as a donor nation doing or funding development projects abroad in a particular country. That's still important, but over half of the development monies now go through multilateral organizations, right? And the idea here again is to sort of strengthen multilateralism and international organizations, because this is where the global structural policy will change, right? Not so much on the bilateral level. You need to go beyond the bilateral level. So this is why I wanted to show you this slide. This was the most important ministry historically, but as you can see now, and of course the Greens don't have the Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, right? But what they took is the Ministry for the Economy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, right? So, and both ministries now have become more sort of internationally activist when it comes to climate, at least. You don't need to remember all of these institutions. And the idea here is that on the subnational level, there's also the idea of sustainability, this concept of sustainability has been received very well, right? So there's lots of sort of institutes, civil society organizations, there's a United Nations association there. There's two sustainability strategies by the Bundesländer, so that's the federated entities, right? So the provinces in Germany. Yeah, they also have sustainability strategies. There's an association of German development and humanitarian aid NGOs, right? And they also deal with sustainability. So there's a sort of a big infrastructure, even on the subnational level, that hopefully self-reinforces, right? The structures that are already there, right? So sustainability really is sort of a societal, there's a societal consensus that you can see here, I'd say. And this is the slide about research organizations or research institutes. All of these four are sort of Potsdam institutes, and this is what I call Potsdam, the German sustainability campus. Right. So there's a sort of a very sort of a dense, right, a network and a strong infrastructure for sustainability sciences in Potsdam, which I think is quite interesting. It's not very well known outside of Potsdam, but this is exactly that kind of scientific infrastructure that you can leverage on the international level as well. Right, so instruments. So how does Germany sort of do sustainability diplomacy or climate diplomacy? And I would say right now, the most important instrument is climate and energy partnerships. And these are sort of two different kinds of partnerships. We have energy partnerships with some countries, and then we have climate partnerships with others. I say we need many more of those, right? And also we need to combine them more, right? So because climate and energy is sort of, they should be sort of two halves of the same debate. Right? And then, of course, there's bilateral and multilateral ODA, and it's still sort of a powerful conditioner and a powerful sort of amplifier of bilateral relations. So that's official development assistance. This means financial and technical cooperation, right? So it's not just sort of giving money, right? So sort of giving loans or grants, or what you can also do is through KfW, so through the development bank, you can provide say climate finance, right? Doesn't have to be ODA then, but it still then serves as a development bank for other countries as well, right? KfW is one of the largest sources of climate finance in the world right now, but it's basically a German development bank. But this kind of financial cooperation or financial facilitation can also sort of then change, the political calculus in other countries and also sort of improve the sustainability there. And technical cooperation would be sort of, aid would be more traditional aid, right? So you help countries change their regulatory bases or improve their policies, say. And of course, then another instrument would be economic investment, right? And opportunities for co-leadership, right? Especially on the multilateral level. We have something that's called the Alliance for Multilateralism. It's a very flexible format within the United Nations. It's really the idea here is to sort of provide a platform for interested and willing, like-minded nations to come up with sort of concrete projects, right? So usually it's France and Germany, and either in conjunction or separate from each other, that then sort of try to look for partners, right? And then push for a certain issue area in the United Nations. The idea here is to create a more unified West, politically speaking, but also sort of create more coherence and more sort of visibility for individual issue areas. Right? So it's really an exercise in activism by individual governments, right? But of course, this flexible structure provides an opportunity for co-leadership, right? So Colombia can also have an idea and then convince Germany to do this together, say. And in foreign relations, this kind of sort of co-leadership or visibility is also a currency. So partners then, right? So the primary partners of Germany's global sustainability activism, of course, are EU member states, right? Here, the consensus on sustainability is deepest, but the European Union also amplifies member states' ambitions and influence, especially in climate diplomacy. Right? And we've talked about self-reinforcing structures, right? But the EU can also amplify these member states' ambitions and also sort of the effects, right, of member state regulations there. So that's why the EU is a great amplifier and makes it very important for any kind of foreign relations, but I would say especially in climate, but also in sustainability. But Germany is trying to bring on board stakeholders from outside the EU as well. right? And these are sort of I would say, the main platforms where you would look, right? The OECD, and Colombia is a member, right? It's been a member since 2018. The G7 and the G20, mostly the G7 and then the G20, because sort of the level of alignment in interests and values is much higher within the G7 than within or amongst the G20. Right? So these climate and energy partnerships already focus on important issues of sustainability, the few that we have. And then the question would be, well, under which conditions could they be transformed into full-blown, more complete sustainability partnerships? And the basic idea is here that you need to look for like-minded partners. Right? And you can find this in all strategy papers right now. It's also on the EU level. But the question, of course, is what is like-mindedness? Right, as a partnership category. It's clear that to be effective, global structural policy needs to go beyond minilateral IOs, international organizations like the G7, right? It's not representative of the world, right? Even though sort of the effect of regulation might be high. It's not very representative. It needs to go beyond that and include other willing stakeholders as well. And in a geopolitical world, this category will only become more important, right, but also much more difficult to operationalize, right? So the question here would be, well, do all like-minded partners have to be democracies, right? Or are all democracies automatically like-minded partners, right? So that's not so easy to decide. And so if you want to think harder about this, and I'll do this really briefly, I'd say there's two things you need to do if you want to identify like-minded partners. First, get a grip on the region that you're talking about, right? So understand the structure of the regional order, right? And sort of the power dynamics, right? And this will help you identify hubs and networks of influence. Right? So sometimes it makes sense, right, to have a regional power on your side, right? I don't know, take a reasonably sort of enlightened regional power like, say, Australia or Japan, or I don't know, well, Brazil before Bolsonaro, right? So then you would have sort of a reasonably enlightened regional partner that is like-minded enough, right, that you can use sort of that partner's influence also to influence the whole neighborhood. Right, and so you can engage with regional organizations, and through the regional powers also sort of in sort of other bilateral or sort of multilateral relationships in the region. Right, so that's the basic idea. So it makes sense to think about sort of, is there a regional power and does it have the necessary influence, right, so that it can do what you want it to do, right? Meaning making a whole region, convincing a whole region that sustainability is a good thing. And then the secondary states, countries like Colombia or like Argentina in Latin America, right, they also have sort of a large amount of influence over smaller states, but also over regional powers, right? If sort of enough secondary states align, right, say in the sustainability or climate change debate, right, then sort of that can help sort of change the posture of a regional power as well, if the regional order is cooperative and not conflictive, right? Of course, that's another condition. Yeah, and then you have regional groupings, like this especially means regional organizations, right? So like-mindedness, sort of you can find in all of these levels, right? But I think the big challenge is how can you lock in, right, this like-mindedness, even if there's a change in government, right, that you can still continue with the cooperation and still sort of work towards sustainability, even though there was a change in governments. And that's especially in Latin America a bit of an issue, right, because of presidential diplomacy and sort of the dependence on regional cooperation on sort of the alignment of different presidents, right, ideological and political alignment of different presidents. Yeah. This is just an example. I've done this for the Asia-Pacific region in another context. This is how the EU assigns partnership profiles, I would call them, in the Asia-Pacific region, as stated in the EU's Indo-Pacific guidelines. And so the question was, well, how can we cooperate? With whom should we cooperate and how? And this is how the Indo-Pac guidelines do this, or propose, right, to work together with these countries. And just, you don't have to read all of this. It's just that the basic idea is that you can identify sort of specific foreign policy instruments for different categories of states, right? So there's things you can do with regional powers that you can't do with small states, right? And vice versa. And then the largest category is sort of the last line here. So as long as the partners are willing and like-minded, there's so much more you can do, right? resilient and sustainable global value change, shared technological standards, green alliances and partnerships, right? All of these things. Of course, for that you need the like-mindedness, and of course, then it doesn't matter whether you're small or large, right? But I would still say there's some things you can do with regional powers that you cannot do with others, right? And vice versa. So it makes sense to think about sort of the regional structure, right? To then assign individual profiles and instruments to sort of become a more effective sustainability player in the region or in the world. And this is sort of the biggest question then, right? What about democracy and like-mindedness, right? We like to say that democracies are sort of reasonably aligned when it comes to interests and values, right? But of course, democracy has been backsliding over the past few years around the world, right? So what does this mean, right, for the effectiveness of such an enlightened foreign policy as, say, sort of the fight against climate change or sustainability, right? The more countries sort of don't want to cooperate or collaborate in these areas, right, the harder or the more impossible, right, it will become to actually achieve anything on the global level. Right? So global structural policy needs everybody to be on the same page, right? And of course, this is more difficult if there's less democracy around the world. But I would still say democracy is not the only sort of element that or conditioning factor that defines a partnership in sustainability. So is Germany a climate change champion, right? That's a question, right? Germany has reduced its CO2 emissions by roughly 40% over its 1990 emission levels. And of course, there's lots of ambitious national policies to fight climate change, right? And Germany has become an activist power internationally, right? I think that's clear. And I would say this global activism is here to stay. Right? So that's not going to change. And why? Because this kind of enlightened activism, in inverted commas, is very compatible, highly compatible to Germany's self-conception as a civilian power. Right? So the self-conception then in global affairs augments the legitimacy and thus the funding of an activist sustainability diplomacy. Right? So because we believe we're a civilian power, right, this is where we want to put our money in, right? We don't want to become a geopolitical power, right, and become, use more robust hard power means, right, but we want to invest, right, in, because of our self-conception, right, into this kind of more enlightened policies on the global level. And this is a bipartisan position, right? So even under the previous administration, climate diplomacy had already been transformed from a managerial climate diplomacy into a more comprehensive, preventative foreign climate policy. So I see this as a bit more sort of broader than just climate diplomacy, right? It has outgrown the foreign policy, right, or the diplomatic element, but it's become much, much broader, right? As I said, there's now sort of a scientific element to it, and there's also sort of a whole of society and whole of government element to it as well, right? So it's become broader and more preventative also, and also better funded. And then I would argue that the securitization of climate change and sustainability will only reinforce that global activism. So I would say Germany will be one of the last countries that turns its back on multilateral engagement and sort of the fight against climate change and the fight for more sustainability, right? Despite what's happening in the Ukraine right now. Right. It was a long introduction. Really quickly, I want to say a few words on the German-Colombian partnership. So just to give you sort of a snapshot, okay, there's 41 projects right now. So this is this year, worth 160 million euros. Okay, so this is these are ODA numbers. Right. And the climate partnerships that do exist with Colombia are between local communities in Germany and Colombia. So that's a subnational, it has a subnational element to it, right? It's not a sort of a bilateral government-to-government sort of treaty or partnership, but it's subnational, which is interesting, but I would say less effective, right? Because it's very difficult to scale up sort of solutions, individual solutions, specific solutions tailored to a particular community, and then scale it up on a national level. That's very difficult, right? So you need both. You need this subnational cooperation, and then you need a structured dialogue between governments to become more effective. So I think there's some room for improvement there. So if you look at sort of the number of projects, right, and where the money comes from, right, I just wanted to show you this. It's quite interesting, is most of the money comes from the Ministry for Development, right? So this is sort of not surprising, right, because the German-Colombian bilateral relationship, so when we talk about these topics, right, climate, health, I don't know, and sustainability more broadly, these are sort of all topics that would fall under the umbrella of development cooperation, right? But you see that almost a fourth of the money comes from the Federal Ministry of the Environment, right? So this is sort of the climate and environment element in the bilateral relationship. And then if you look at what we do in Colombia, right? It's all in German here. If you take the first one in green, so on the top right, this green sort of section is health, right? And then if you go right, it's water and wastewater, and then it's state and civil society, and then it's crisis prevention, right? That's of course in the Colombian case is very important right now. So this will be the dark blue element, and then if you go on the light brown element, right, on the bottom left side is environmental protection, right? So this is where most of the money goes to. So I think this is also quite interesting. So when we talk about sort of development cooperation, what we mean is conflict prevention and environment. And then on top of this, of course, there's a lively scene of research collaborations, 260 university partnerships, and academic exchange. Right? In 2020, the German Academic Exchange Service had 175 scholarships for Germans in Colombia and 779 for Colombians in Germany. Right? So you have sort of this sort of lively academic exchange on top of all this. And the main pillars of the bilateral scientific relations are an excellent Center for Oceanic Studies, CEMARIN, and CAPAS, the German-Colombian Peace Institute. And so I'd say Colombia is one of the countries that Germany has sort of the most structured scientific relations, which is interesting, especially in Latin America. It used to be Argentina, it's now Colombia. So how then should we go beyond the bilateral relationship? Right? I've argued before that sort of you need to sort of use, you can use countries to sort of try to influence the whole region. And you can do this by using this instrument. It's called Trilateral Cooperation. Right? You have 3 countries instead of 2. It's a way of sort of making ODAs, official development assistance, less hierarchical in a sense, right? So there's still a facilitating partner, is the partner that gives the money. There's a beneficiary, right? And then you have a pivotal partner, which is usually a country then from the region, right? And Colombia is one of the countries. Colombia and Mexico and Uruguay are the 3 countries where sort of German Development Cooperation has the most triangular cooperation projects, right? And the idea here is in the pivotal partner, which is usually an emerging country, to sort of create more human resources, right? Or sort of more capacities, right? It's capacity building in these development areas, and make use of sort of more regional or localized knowledge, right? In development cooperation. So that's the basic idea, even though the money still comes from a donor nation in the global north. But this would be sort of one way of creating sort of local networks and influencing or changing sort of the paradigms in the region. Right, so this is triangular cooperation, right? Enhance and amplify triangular cooperation with Colombia to advance sustainability in Latin America, right? This would be sort of one idea, right? To go beyond the bilateral relationship. Use the hub and spoke approach, right? Use Colombian influence in regional organizations, right? Could be the Pacific Alliance, but could be others as well. Take the Organization of American States, right? It's not a very effective organization, but it's one, or others, right? To set the sustainability agenda in the region would be a way. Use hub and spoke. Enable multilateralism, right? Convince Colombia to become a more active member in the Alliance for Multilateralism in the UN, right? Especially in sustainability matters. Might be a way sort of it might be an opportunity for co-leadership. Right? Leverage civil society, right? Civil societies should use their influence and visibility, and they have visibility, especially in Germany, more to put issues of sustainability on the political agenda. Right? So this sort of would be sort of ideas. If you have ideas on how to improve the bilateral relationship, please sort of ask these questions now. Right? Yeah, because this leads me into the debate, right? what happens in a bilateral relationship, despite all of these enlightened values, right, usually is this, right, that you have implementing agencies that are so powerful that they impose, right, their ideas, right, and their concepts on the partner country, even though, you know, the discourse is very different. But in practice, this is what usually happens, right? So this is a question for you, the audience. How can Bogota introduce its own ideas to Berlin, and how should Germany incorporate Colombian ideas better? And through multilateral fora, high-level summits, the bilateral commission, right, or through other sort of dialogue mechanisms. And I'd be happy to hear your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rick. This was a very interesting presentation. I learned a lot. Definitely, sustainability is a crucial issue around the world. We must be aware of the importance of a policy for sustainability diplomacy to protect our world. It caught my attention when you say that cooperation of sustainability issues can improve international relations. Absolutely. This is why we are here. We all have the same problems. And absolutely, we can learn a lot from Germany because you have done wonderful things, as you mentioned. My last comment would be these very important words that you mentioned as equity, quality of life, social cohesion, global responsibility, and social issues. We agree that we all need this, and this is very important for the whole world. So I'm very happy to hear this from you. And now we will move to the Q&A questions, to the session. We have only 10 minutes for this part, so we will be finishing at 11:15 in Colombia time. And I will just mention some of the questions I have here for you. The first question is, recently in Colombia, the government authorities are talking about scientific diplomacy. Could be scientific diplomacy an emerging policy field?
Absolutely. Scientific diplomacy is growing steadily. There's not much research being done on it right now. I'm writing a book on it. I'm writing a book on the history of West German science diplomacy, because the argument there is that it's not as new as it might look, right? So as a concept, it's been around for maybe 15 years or so. But of course, scientific cooperation, right? And even including a foreign policy element and an understanding in the political elites that this will sort of improve bilateral relations and also multilateralism. Even that idea harkens back to the 1950s. Right? So that's I'd say it's old, right, as a policy area, but it will become more important as part of foreign relations. Absolutely.
Okay, great. The next question is how these sustainability projects would be financed in the event that the government does not have the capacity to exercise these economic interests?
I would say the primary responsibility, of course, for sustainability lies with the nation states themselves, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense that Germany sort of funds or takes on the funding of sustainability in a country like Colombia, right? It has to be Colombian money, Colombian solutions for Colombians. But of course, and this is sort of tricky, right, in development cooperation. What Germany needs to do is sort of change the perspective a bit and become an enhancer or a facilitator for Colombian ideas. Right. So I understand that the Colombian government doesn't have the money to do all the sort of the great project that it wants to do, but here then the international community can step in. Countries like Germany is an important donor nation also, right? But the idea really is to sort of enhance local political ideas, right? So it's Germany ideas.
Maybe we can link this to the next question, which says, for Germany, the sustainable development goals would be more achievable because of the cooperative structure that's been built in Europe. How those developed countries could help Colombia to achieve them?
I don't understand the question. So what's the connection between SDGs and sort of the collaborative structures in Europe?
The person here says that you guys do really well developing and achieving the goals, the sustainability development goals that is more difficult for Colombia. How could countries like you, developed countries that are more developed than our country, help us to achieve these goals?
All right. Well, I would say, well, beyond development cooperation, but I think we have to sort of move beyond that, right? Because it still has this hierarchy, right? There's still a donor nation and a recipient country. And what Agenda 2030 is trying to do is changes the perspective and the paradigm, right? So, and the narrative also, right? So the idea is that all countries have this responsibility and they share this responsibility. And this is why we help other countries sort of become more sustainable, right? Not because, I don't know, because we have all the answers, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would say is the second element here is what helps is to sort of take this idea of self-reinforcing structures that I've presented, right? So the idea really is that it doesn't make sense to help Colombia become more sustainable, right? We need to help sort of the whole region become more sustainable. Right? And this is then why we need to sort of invest. And I think this is something that Germany should do because of its sort of particular history and also its history in the EU. We should invest more in more cooperative structures in the region. Right? So this means helping out regional organizations to become more effective, right? And you can do this by becoming an observer nation or becoming a donor nation to an organization, right? And the idea is to socialize countries into a more cooperative stance. And this is something you learn in multilateral fora, but you don't learn it at the UN. You learn it with your neighbors in your region. And I think this is something that Germany should do much more.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you can answer this question, but somebody wants to know if currently there are projects in Colombia and Germany together about this topic, and how could the university be linked in the development of these projects?
Well, I wouldn't know about particular projects, right? But if I've shown you, and I've shown you the sectors or the sectoral distribution of the ODA, and so lots of money is going into environmental projects, and these are the projects the most connected to sustainability. And all development projects in Germany have this sustainability test they need to pass. Right? So it doesn't matter what kind of project you do or you engage in, it must not lead to less sustainability, right? And this then, if you look at the OECD DAC principles or so, it means that you need to sort of include local stakeholders, right? And and there's a couple of sort of principles that sort of guarantee that a project becomes sustainable in inverted commas. But the question about universities is interesting because that's the research infrastructure necessary to come up with local solutions, right? Civil society doesn't hack. It can have sort of it can generate common sense solutions, right? But you need the science. You need a research infrastructure to come up with evidence-based policy input, right? And this is something that the universities have to do. And I think it's a great way to think about development cooperation. So why does Germany not sort of fund or finance not the universities per se, but fund research projects, right, that improve regulation policy on the national level in Colombia? Would be a great way to leverage the research infrastructure at home.
Absolutely. Okay, another question is there any agreement between Colombia and Germany to fight against climate change?
Not bilaterally, but of course multilaterally, right? So we're also members of the Agenda 2030, right? We're all signatory states to it. We all signed the Paris Climate Accords, right? This is where the cooperation happens. And then if you look at sort of more bilateral projects, you would have to look at the sources of funding, right? So if there's a global fund for, I don't know, there's a blue fund for oceanic protection. There's a green fund for, other things. There's a global fund for malaria. Right? So if you look at these funds or institutions, right, then Germany will always be one of the top 3 donors. Right. So Germany invests in those institutions, and then of course the money then flows to the local projects. And I think this is superior to a purely bilateral understanding of aid. Right? And this is the institution building element that I was talking about. So, and there you would find many examples, right, where German money helps local issues.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Another question would be how long it takes for these sustainability projects to be implemented and have an impact on both countries?
Oh, wow. So that's a question about effectiveness and about impact. And that's a hard one, a hard nut to crack. Well, first things first, I would say we need to evaluate projects better. We don't need more evaluation, but we need better evaluation. Germany has only started to sort of evaluate its projects on a sort of permanent and continuous basis in, I think, 2012 or so, with the creation of a evaluation institute for development cooperation projects. So this has improved, I think, the quality of evaluation. But I still feel evaluation is not sort of the best way to improve impact. Right? You can sort of, it does many other things like transparency and it's that accountability, that's all fine. But on the impact side, evaluations, I think, still sort of lack some quality. That's really difficult to do. Also because development cooperation is a self-sustaining system, right? So all projects are programmed to be successful, right? That's the big problem in development cooperation. So it's hard to find honest evaluation. Yeah, but I would say sort of the upside is then at least, you know, development cooperation goes on. Yeah, but I think we need a different kind of evaluation to make impact more visible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. There are more questions, but we will send them to you and maybe we can answer all the people. They were very interesting. For now, we just want to thank you once again, Professor Rick, for your time and for being part of the HEPCOPA lecture series. It was an important, significant lecture to envision solutions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, sorry about the technical issues. But thank you very much for the invitation.
Okay, so thank you so much to all the people who were connected on our YouTube channel. We invite you next Wednesday, March 16th, to our closing lecture, What Does the Society of the Future Look Like? By Dr. Reinhard Babel, Director of DAAD Regional Office in Bogota. See you soon and thank you very much. Bye-bye.